the striker. Bear with me, doing it a little bit backwards.
Nice.
Gun goes bang.
And we're a go. Welcome everybody to this episode. This one's going to be a little bit different. We are recording this one instead of going live because we're going to be touching stuff in YouTube. Doesn't like all that stuff while you're doing the live, so we're recording it. So if you're adding comments, we may or may not respond to it like we normally do. But at any rate, we have a special guest for special on many levels.
An actual gun maker.
An actual gun maker. And this conversation we wanted to have with an actual gun maker, somebody who designed a gun a long time ago, brought it to market. What is it now? 2 years ago when it actually hit the market.
Yeah, two and a half years. The gun's been on the market.
Yeah.
How long has it been in production, or not production, but in design?
Well, we were shooting prototypes in 2014. So, it was the original discussion about, hey, it'd be fun if we started a gun company. Rob, you could design a gun. That conversation happened in March of 2013.
Okay.
And then within a year and a half, we were shooting a prototype. And then it, for various reasons, took almost another decade to get it to market.
Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of people on the YouTubes and the internets talking about the P320. I unfortunately jumped on the bandwagon to yell at people because I have a thing about why the P320 is the way it is. We can talk about it later. But none of these people have designed a gun, made a gun, worked with the engineers directly to make the gun. So I think this is the awesomeness of this conversation, is to have somebody who knows what the fuck they're talking about. And one of the things that I respect, it always seems like we're kissing your ass, dude. But one of the things that I highly respect about about Rob Pincus is that he actually does the homework before he says the words. Well, 99% of the time you do that. And there's a lot of knowledge and a lot of reading up on, like, if you have a question about why the tap safety exists, Pincus knows the guy that designed the tap safety probably, and he's got him on text. It usually goes like that. Oh, let me text the guy right now.
Let me text the guy. Yeah. That guy's too old for text, but
send him a fax.
Yeah. Fax him in his car though, because he made a lot of money.
Yeah. So at any rate, we want to have this conversation about handgun engineering and this whole idea of a smooth trigger press or any other dumb shit that the douchery brings out when it comes to a handgun for self-defense. And I do want to focus more on handguns for self-defense. And I think too many humans forget that we're talking about handguns that were catered or at least marketed to the self-defense market that maybe shouldn't be marketed to the self-defense market, like the P320.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it, right? That, I've said this a lot, especially recently, but I've said it since the gun came out. The trigger has always, in any version, seemed to me to have too short a length of pull, and I see no reason why it doesn't have a tab safety, which is common practice. I'm not even crazy about the hinge version of the tab safety that the M&Ps use. Like, I just, since Glock introduced that, and since we understand, especially when you have a striker fired gun that is has a striker that is held in significant amount of rearward tension when everything's at rest, waiting for somebody to pull the trigger, like the 320 obviously is, then I feel like it should be obvious that you want a tab safety on there. And there was an incident. We'll just jump right into it, if it's all right with you, with my 320 thoughts.
Yeah.
There was an incident shortly after the 320 came out. I'm guessing it's like a decade ago. I think gun's been out for 11 years now, maybe. One of the guys, not James Yeager, but one of his guys from Tactical Response was at a range, I believe it was Sacramento. And they did a thing where for what I don't pretend to understand all the nuances about it. Back in the day, I think I talked to James about it. He explained it. I didn't think it was a great idea, but I sort of understand their rationale. And what they would do is they would take a gun, take a Glock, and they would have it chambered. Apparently, was the common practice. Drop it on the ground and like stomp on the gun and kind of grind it into the ground a little bit to show that you have to be willful, I think was the idea. You have to willfully like pull the trigger. Like the gun's just not going to go bang. And one of his guys, apparently unfamiliar with the 320, tried that demo in a gravel or dirt parking lot in outside of this range in California and stomped on the gun and kicked it, ground on it, whatever he did. But in that little bit of twisting motion that ostensibly this guy had done or seen done repeatedly with a Glock with the 320 around went into somebody's car.
I remember that.
And
Right.
so, yeah, and they were, they're banned from there. And it was another one of those like James's reckless things. And there are some things that James has done that I would defend forever and just say that I don't do it, but I would defend it. That's not one I would defend, but I understand why they did it and I disagree with it. But with the 320, it doesn't work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work is that wasn't a drop safe issue. That was a crisp, relatively short length of pull, the length from front to back from when you start engaging the trigger until the gun goes bang, and relatively light trigger press. And I think the distance is far more important. The crispness or the shortness of the travel is far more important than the weight. And I think a lot of people have found that historically now that the 320, even through all its iterations, and certainly there's definitely more weight to the break now, apparently, the guns that are coming out nowadays, and I don't have a current model with me, but like the military guns, the break is at a higher level, maybe 5-6 pounds, but it's still a very short distance of travel. And that is one thing that I think hugely contributes to these incidents. And it takes away a really easy, plausible deniability thing that Sig could say as well. It takes a certain amount of travel to set the gun off. And there's this little tab that if you're not actually engaging fully on the front of the trigger, or something isn't engaging fully on the front of the trigger, then the trigger can't move. Because I don't think they're wrong to be saying that to the best of their knowledge and to their understanding, the gun won't go bang unless the trigger is moved rearward. Yeah. I just think the asterisk on that should be, but it doesn't have to move much, and it's pretty easy to move it.
So
go ahead. I was going to say, was the purpose of that demonstration at Tactical Response to talk about carrying around in the chamber on a striker fired gun and why?
I don't remember. Yeah, like I said, I probably knew the details, 8-10 years ago, but I don't remember exactly what the thing was. But it was something to that point that these guns don't just go bang. You have to willfully do it. And it might even have been like, in my classes, I talk about dropping the gun, right? Like if fire ants are crawling up your leg and you get hot brass in your glasses or something, and you just can't safely control the gun, you got to do something with your body, just drop the gun. And I tell people all the time, no, I don't throw a gun down that's got a round chamber in it just to make the point, right? But I tell people all the time, like if you haven't done something to your gun to make it not drop safe, then we're going to move forward as if all these modern guns in the class are drop safe if we know them and believe them to be so, which is why I initially banned all of the non-updated, which again, another problem with the 320, the non-upgraded guns from the original batches, which I think that was the first indication that Sig was not going to, handle the 320 the way I think a lot of other gun companies would have when they didn't do a mandatory recall on that original 320 problem, the 45-degree drop angle problem. They had this trigger that is now the one that ships with it ready to go. So they obviously knew that, you could make the trigger more robust, let's say. And in that initial batch, they chose, and this has been my statement on it, I believe they chose to market a target style gun with a target shooting style trigger to the market and ultimately to the military and law enforcement as a duty or carry type home defense type firearm. And I think that was a huge mistake. And I think it continues to be a mistake. And I think it's now, definitely biting them in the ass to have chased range performance type trigger performance in what ostensibly is being sold as a duty or carry gun.
This was my video that I just did when I jumped on the bandwagon to talk shit about the P320. I've always talked shit about the Sig P320s. It's just not a gun that I was a huge fan of for a variety of reasons. But my complaint was it's kind of with Sig and gun manufacturers, but it's also the market, right? Like the market thinks they know what they want. And unfortunately, a lot of gun companies will just market to them. This is how we ended up with subcompact firearms, the 42s and the 43s. And then all of a sudden, we realized as a market, oh shit, these guns are not as awesome as we think they are. And then now we're back to the P365 X macro. And now they got back to the Glock 48 sizes and
and the fuse, I think, is out there now is kind of the evolution. The 365 fuse is basically a 19 plus size gun.
Yeah, so it's the market saying on Reddit, we want these guns, and then the gun manufacturers see it and they're like, well, shit, let's make money. And I get it from a business perspective, but it's we see that a lot. People wanting shit that they don't know about. And then
there's a cart and a horse thing there for sure.
Yeah.
Look at what's happened with 2011s. What double stack 1911s all of a sudden over the last 5 years have become super cool again. And people are carrying them. People are showing up to the range with them. I had somebody show up to a class last week in New Mexico with one, and he had malfunctions 2 minutes in, and it was like shocking. The 1911 style gun is the one that has the malfunctions. And they had a big problem with people finding out they were essentially Series 70s. For people who know 1911s, they were an older version of a trigger style that was not drop safe. And they got into a lot of heat for that. So now they're making them drop safe. But I think part of the problem, and maybe this is where I fall, like the responsibilities on me as a manufacturer to put a gun out there that is what it should be, not kind of give the people what they want, so to speak. It's about educating the consumer so that they get the best version of what they want, or maybe the most practical version of what they want, balancing out all the various balances that have to go into a carry gun. Now I'm not making a lot of money, right? Like, so let's be honest about that, right? I mean, to some extent, even these companies that are people like I kind of half jokingly, really, to push back on the America First bill, right? For years, I've taken shit for driving a Toyota, right? And it's like, because for years I did. My FJ was my primary vehicle for a long time, then a 4Runner. It's kind of gone away because I drive other cars. I drove German cars, my primary cars, for a while, and I would always respond like, hey, when you have an American-made phone and computer you can respond and criticize me from, let me know. And then it's like you could go down the path of, well, most of the Toyota is made in the US, or the BMW X6 is made in the US at BMW's largest factory on the planet, even though they're a German automaker. So there are Americans being employed to do it all. But then ultimately, if you're really going to be this MAGA America First guy, why do we have like the handgun market in America dominated by people who are screaming America First and MAGA and whatever else, dominated by European companies? They're like, well, they're in New Hampshire. That money goes to Europe. And I've worked with a lot of these companies, not Sig in particular, but the orders come from Europe too. And the policies come from Europe, and the approvals come from Europe, and the budgets get set in Europe, and the money flows back to Europe. And that's with Sig, and that's with Glock, and that's with all the companies that are there. And now, like, I do a lot of work with Canik now, right? Canik's a Turkish company. I caught flack for a video I put up yesterday using a Canik. Somebody's like, I don't use guns from Islamist nations that hate the U.S. And I was like, what, do you use Karakol? Like, I don't know, like Islamic nations that like the U.S., the Emirates? I don't know. But that guy probably carries a Glock, right? And thinks, or, well, that's okay because it's made in Georgia, even though the money flows back to Austria. So it's really, to me, there's a lot of confusion in the marketplace when people say, this is what I like. And you ask them why, and they hit a wall that runs into a logic, block real quick. They say they want a gun that's good for defense, but they use metrics of range performance.
Correct.
Right. And that's the trigger. That's the sights. That's the you got to have a red dot if you want to be able to protect yourself. Red dots that didn't exist 10 years ago, right? Forget about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the way they do now.
I wonder
But
how they defended themselves in the 90s without the red dots and
yeah,
early
so
2000s.
it's you know, you got to have 52 rounds. If you don't carry 52 rounds, you know, or whatever made up number, even one of the organizations that normally doesn't go so over the top put up a weird video the other day, and it was like a flash mob of looters, like with bags and masks, going to rob a store. And apparently the scene is out in the street, and they all pull up and they all run in, and then the store owner apparently fires a shot, waves a gun. The whole mob runs away. But the lesson's supposed to be, if you're not prepared to shoot 52 people, you're not ready. And it's like,
Yeah.
dude waved a gun
that was
around
the
and fired a
take.
shot, maybe in the
Yeah.
ground, and they all ran away. Like, so I
That was
don't,
a
you know,
that was a
people,
lot of influencers and companies making that same point on that video.
yeah, so
Completely
weird.
missing the point of, you know, one round did it. Now you could say like, well, what if it didn't? Uh, Point to an example where something like that escalated to the point where somebody did need to take out all of those people.
And again, even if you found one, right? It's like,
Mhm.
show me a video of somebody responding to an ambush in the weaver position, double tapping. Like,
Mhm.
even after officers were trained for, you know, many years, some of them over a decade, practicing doing that all the time, they don't do it once dash
Mhm.
cameras started coming out. You know, and in '97, I was looked at as really, I was, you know, told I was a dumb upstart kid trying to be different just to be different, for saying standing sideways and double tapping is stupid. But you know, I don't see a lot of people doing that in 2025. That aged well. I think smooth, long trigger presses in the 4 to 6 pound range for defensive carry, I think that'll age well too. And I honestly, like, one of the benefits of this conversation about the 320 might be that we get to it. Now, unfortunately, we're already seeing the overcorrection now, right?
Yeah.
You got people like, yeah, the Beretta PX4 Storm is the best defensive gun ever. You don't, because look at 320s, they'll kill you. Double action, single actions, where it's at, bro. And it's like they're wearing basket weave shoes, you know, like pushing their sleeves up. You got the dippity do. Like, I don't know what's going on with this
Checking their pager.
80s
Yeah.
retro. Fax me in my car.
So
But
let's talk a little bit about the necessity of the or lack of necessity of a competition trigger in a self-defense context from the point of view of that kinesthetic and how the body reacts to the stress and what's important in that moment.
well, what I look at is the numbers, right? Like, go to, you know, I say it all the time, like Tom Gibbons at Rangemaster, he has the best data set, you know, the most objective data set that we're aware of as far as actual defensive handgun uses. But even if you look at broader anecdotal stuff, just the videos we see all the time, the dash camera videos, if you go to law enforcement and look at their numbers, what you usually need to do, and by usually I mean like 85+% of the time, is hit a chest size target. Well, usually it's what you see in that video is you shoot at the bad guy and they run away. So take all of those, which is the vast majority, like as soon as the good guy starts making bang bang sounds, the bad guys all run away. Take that out of the equation, and the bad guys that actually need to be shot, right, that need a physical stop, which is what we train for, what we carry for, you're talking about multiple rounds delivered quickly into the high center chest, right? Like hit the torso a couple few times quickly, and that seems to be what is required to physically stop a threat when threats need to be physically stopped. So that is not, and at distances of 9 to 15 feet, right, around cars, from the corner of a room to a door, in a convenience store, from the doorway to the counter, or from the counter to the last end of the aisle, you know, those kinds of distances. So around a gas pump, when you're shooting at those distances at an 8-inch circle or a 10 by 8 square or something, it's just not that challenging, right? It's not the kind of thing you need a $2,000 Sig P320 for. You don't need a CZ Shadow. You don't need a Alien, you know, Lugo or whatever that one's called with the crazy awesome trigger from Czech Republic. Like, you don't need those guns. You don't need the staccato. You don't need anything other than a relatively decent trigger press and a good kinesthetic extension. You need to have the gun aligned, you know, out in front of your eyes. You're going to be looking at the threat. Obviously, it's got your attention. If you have a good platform behind the gun and just a relatively smooth trigger press, you're not going to be able to pull that gun so far that you're deviating off of that chest. Now, people, well, what if you have to take a headshot? What if you have to shoot at 50 yards? Yes, those things could happen. And we see people doing that with snub nose revolvers. Go look at the internet. I'm not just talking about Jerry Michalik, right? I'm talking about anybody that if they carry a snub nose revolver and they take one of the snub nose revolver classes that are offered by guys like Claude Werner and things, you're gonna develop that skill. Double action, single action, same thing. You're gonna learn to press through that long, heavy double action first shot. So if we cut that in half, if we keep most of the distance of a double action trigger, but we cut the weight in half or even more in some cases, and we go down to that 5 pound-ish trigger that's moving relatively far compared to a 1911, but not as far as a double action revolver, you end up, I think, in what is the sweet spot for defensive accuracy. And that's really what it comes down to for me is what is most likely to be required, what can be justified in terms of shooting to defend yourself or others. And you're not talking about headshots at 100 yards.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you see a lot with the 1911 on YouTube is when people want to do their little B-roll, they're showing how incredibly fast they can shoot with the 1911. From a defensive point of view, is there any value or trade-off in being able to, let's just ballpark, double the speed of your shooting based strictly on the short distance of the trigger press and the relatively light trigger press?
Well, I think it's a flawed premise, honestly, Isaac, because in my experience watching people shoot at all levels, right? I don't know. There aren't very many students. I mean, like less than 15, it's like 15% of the students that I have on the line that can't shoot reliably 4 to 5 shots per second into the high center chest with a modern striker fired gun, right? So how much faster is that average person at the end of their first day of training going to be with a single action trigger? And maybe they're going to get to 6 shots per second, but 6 shots per second is still pretty darn fast. Now you get beyond that. Now you're getting into trick shooting, right? You're getting into like Jerry Michalik stuff, right? You can find guys who can shoot 6, 7 shots per second out of 1911s pretty regularly into the high center chest out there at 12 to 15 feet. But those guys are also going to be able to shoot maybe 1 less shot per second with any normal modern striker fired gun, right? So
Yeah,
where do you lose? You asked about
yeah.
the balances, right? The trade-offs are the manual safety. So for the people that I see that might go from 4 shots to approaching 6 shots per second after they reach extension, but they flub turning the safety offer on at the wrong time, and maybe they're getting 0 shots per second because their safety is still on, that's a big problem. So we want to take that completely out of the equation. And again,
Yeah.
look at the numbers, right? The numbers say almost every time good guy starts shooting at the bad guy, hits or not, bad guy retires. So engaging a target across your bedroom, around your car, in that retail environment, in that restaurant, in your workplace, being able to put 4 or 5 shots per second into the high center chest, which is something, like I said, 1 day of training, proper training, really focusing on developing a good rhythm, balance of speed and precision, I think just about anybody can do with a modern striker fired gun. And then at the higher end, that doesn't mean you can't regularly hit target. I mean, we talk about Jaeger. Like Jaeger was famous for his demos of using the big dot sights with standard Glock 19 regular trigger and being able to hit targets out at 100 yards, right? Carl from Tactical Rifleman just posted a review using the PD-10, and he even says there, he goes, "I don't think this is what Rob intended this gun for, but sometimes I like to have fun and do long distance pistol shooting." And he's dinging steel out at 100 yards with it. The PD-10 is incredibly accurate. And does the trigger feel different than a standard Glock or M&P, or certainly different from the 320? Yeah, but once you understand smooth trigger press until the gun goes bang, people are demonstrating all kinds of, cutting cards in half and shooting tight groups and all kinds of stuff with the PD-10 trigger, which is ostensibly like the opposite of what I think Sig was trying to do with the 320. And yet it's fully capable as a gun of being very, very accurate, and certainly defensively accurate in anybody's hands, especially if you had that 1 day of training.
So the question about speed is really kind of a devil's advocate question, because that is the common refrain from people who are shooting single action triggers, and watching it on YouTube and thinking, "Oh, I could do that. I could shoot that fast. I could shoot the bad guy that fast," when that's not really reflected in reality. I think from my own observation, and I might be wrong about this, but my own observation is in self-defense, people tend not to shoot faster than they can see and perceive. especially when they're intentional about the self-defense shooting. They're not shooting, 0.1 splits. They're shooting more closely 0.25 splits in self-defense shooting. And I think like the conclusion I would draw from that, if it's true, is that there's a melding of the physical skill with what is necessary and what is attainable in that moment, as
Well,
opposed to what you can do on the range when you're choreographing and you're planning and all that stuff.
I think that's for trained people, for well practiced and well trained people who are kind of alert to what's going on, that aren't in a panic. I think that's true. I think you
Hmm.
see some people obviously who are just pulling the trigger as fast as they can, physically as fast as they can. And that's why I think it's so important to get out on the range and do that, right? That's why we spend more time doing that than we do practicing headshots at 21 feet for sure,
Hmm.
right? Let people get a car's distance or a bedroom distance from the target, drive the gun out and fire the fastest 3, 4, 5, 6 shots they can, so they understand what they're capable of. And I think most people are surprised. That's why we have drills like the push your limits drill, right? Like, we want people out there to push themselves to see how fast they actually can keep all those shots within a fist or under a wide open hand, for sure, at 9, 10, 12, 15 feet, even when they're pushing as fast as they possibly can with their gun, which gets them into that 5 shots per second range for most people. uh, I think people are capable more than they think they are, but they have to practice it, because
Hmm.
otherwise, if they're always standing sideways, push pull, right? If they're always out there with one eye closed, just trying to shoot that one whole group at 25 yards, then that's all they're used to. And I think there's one of those tropes of training, right? Is that you can, shoot at 3-inch circles if you expect to be able to hit an 8-inch circle because your skills are going to degrade. Well, I don't think what we saw when we first started seeing dash camera videos, like a lot of them, and surveillance camera videos of shootings in the late 90s and in through the 2000s, we weren't seeing skills degrade. We were seeing the skills that were being practiced on the range not being applied. We weren't seeing people standing sideways double tapping. We were seeing people lower their center of gravity, drive the gun out to full extension, and pull the trigger super fast, probably without regard for their sights. And so it was a completely different thing. It was completely improvised. And obviously what we try to do, and what we're not the only ones, a lot of people try to do in their training now, is refine what the body does naturally and work well with that squared off stance, full extension, lowered center of gravity, head inside the triangle, get behind the gun, get the gun to your line of sight, don't move your line of sight to the gun, that kind of stuff. And it works. It just works really, really, really well, as long as the gun fits a person's hand. And again, they have a relatively smooth trigger press, which can be really super fast or can be super slow. And one of the things I think is important to talk about too is this idea of staging, right? I think that's where a lot of people have gotten wrapped around the axle on these demos with the 320 can just go off with very little trigger pressure. Well, I think there are a lot of people out there who apparently think like staging the trigger isn't pulling the trigger somehow.
Yeah, yeah,
And what they
yeah.
don't understand is, and I got one of the FCUs here, like when you quote unquote stage the trigger, right? This little flapper here is going to move, right? So that little flapper that moves, that's disengaging the striker block safety. So what you think of as taking up the slack or staging or something other than pulling a trigger, it's pulling the trigger, right? And that's why we talk about pulling all the way through, right, until the gun goes bang, and learning to press a trigger properly. And I think that's incredibly important too. Like you talk about that headshot at 20 yards. If you're trying to make that shot, the person's probably not just standing still daring you to do it. They're not giving you a free one, right? Like they may be moving. They have somebody, knife point. They're moving backwards, or they're arguing, or they're holding a gun on somebody, and you're going to try to shoot their head while it's moving. You've got to be able to maintain sight picture throughout a smooth trigger press, not try to, you know, take up all the
Yeah.
slack, which again is still pulling the trigger, hold your breath, make everything perfect, and then break the shot against a piece of steel or a piece of paper on the range. That works really well. You can get good at it, but that's not the dynamic nature of a defensive shooting.
Yeah, it's the I think I mean you kind of already said it, but Isaac and I were having that conversation, is like seeing that P320 without doing what people say it does, without any real huge modifications. And I think Isaac asked me like, "Yeah, but what are the modifications?" And my reply was sticking a fucking screw in it. Uh,
Yeah, yeah.
like,
I
if you stick a
so
fucking screw in a gun to press the trigger back a little bit, and then you fuck with it, like that just, I mean, you made the guns.
Well, yeah,
Okay. So this was a carry gun of mine. It says 43L because before the Glock 48 had the shield magazines available, I would sometimes carry a 48 slide on a 43, right, giving me a long slide 43, because the difference between the 43's capacity, especially with an extended mag, and the standard 10+1 of the Glock 48 wasn't much, right? So this gun's been retired for a while. It's clear. You'll see I have modified it. I have opened up the back, and this is congruent with what the FBI test that was done on the Michigan State Police 320. Opened the back up so that I can reach the internals, because it's important to remember that when they had the gun go bang, theoretically without moving the trigger at all, manipulating the trigger, they were sticking a tool in the back and manipulating the internal parts of the trigger mechanism. And I've got a here it is. I've got a little primed case, right? Because why not? And let's see if I crimp the front end there a little bit, get it in there. Look, this is the kind of thing you can do at the office at night because there's nobody else here.
Your cleaning lady's gonna freak out.
Oh no, they don't even clean my office. They're like, nope. All right, can I get that in there? No. Okay. So I've got that in there. Now, the tab safety on here, when tab safeties first came out, right, and I think the majority of the community, when we first started seeing a lot of tab safeties on the Glocks in the late 80s and then through the 90s and the 2000s, I think most people were like me, whereas they really thought of it as a snag safety, right? So that if only the edge of the trigger gets hit by something, the trigger can't move. But the reality is most manufacturers consider the tab safety being there for an inertial block of, if the gun drops, the weight of the trigger shoe might be enough to overcome, as its momentum continuing to move back because of inertia might be enough to overcome the springs and the tension inside the gun and actually discharge the gun when it falls backwards. So not anything being jostled inside, not the striker bouncing, but the trigger actually being pressed by its own weight. So the tab safety will defeat that because the tab blocks it from moving back. And that's where Sig says they don't need a tab safety on the 320. And that's where the hinged type safety, the hinge inertial safety on the M&P still works. It still accomplishes a safety goal, even though it doesn't also have what I think is an added benefit of the tab type inertial safety, which is the snag safety issue as well. That makes sense. So, yeah. But you said earlier, Edgar, we were talking, you said that you always knew of it as an inertial safety.
Yeah, my understanding of it was a drop safety. Yeah,
exactly. Sure. Yeah, drop safety from inertial safety. So you have that graphic of the three safeties. Because we're talking about the Glock. People would say, we're talking about the nomenclature, and people would say, oh, well, Glock has three internal safeties. But I don't think people could really describe the functions of those three internal safeties, right? The three safeties on the Glock. And that's where I would say, like, I care about an external manually operated safety that requires an action that wouldn't otherwise be necessary, right? So you've got like the grip safety on an XD or a XDS, right? I have to grip the gun anyway, so I'm not worried about that external safety that is manually operated. The tab safety, I'm not worried about that external safety that is manually operated because I have to engage and press the trigger anyway. Right. So if I have to do those things anyway, I'm talking about buttons or levers, extra steps that have to be taken. So, yeah, I think people should have drop safe guns. I think people should be secure and comfortable in the knowledge that their guns are designed so that they won't go bang unless the trigger is actuated. But I don't necessarily think everybody has to be an engineer and really understand what's going on in there. Now,
yeah,
I'm going to try to.
The conversation was this. Everybody gets so focused on, like, I need to choose the perfect gun, and like, no, you just need to understand how they operate a little bit.
If you understand how they basically operate inside, then I think to me your use of the gun and the way you treat the gun as a tool becomes much more educated. Correct. Right? And like, you don't start thinking about the idea that taking up the slack is somehow different from pulling the trigger. Right. Yeah. I've heard people even articulate the idea that, well, you want to be able to take up the slack and then make your decision to shoot. No, I do not. I don't have my finger on the wall or on the brake. I don't want to be. No, it's not when I'm making the decision to shoot. I'm making a decision to shoot when my finger goes to the trigger, right?
Correct.
Like I've made the decision. Now I'm going to start pressing. And yeah, could I always change my mind? Sure. Can I change my mind on 1911? Not much
No.
time. Can I change my mind on a double action, single action, like a P226 Sig? Yeah, there's more time, especially if it's a 25-yard headshot. I've got more time as I slowly, smoothly press that trigger. But I don't think we're counting on that as a responsible use issue. My responsible use is finger stays up here until I've decided to shoot. Once I start pressing, I've made the decision to shoot. Could I stop it? Sure. But that's not part of my tactics, right? All right, so this is a little different than the demo you saw with the 320. We're going to talk about the height issue. We're going to talk about the striker fired gun on a hammer fired gun frame issue, which I think is really relevant and important. But first, we're going to talk about the trigger only moved a millimeter kind of thing and what's happening when that trigger moves. So I have to disable the tab safety and I have to take up some of the slack, and then I'm going to try to jam this screw in there without setting the gun off, obviously, and give it a couple twists. Okay, I think that's pretty well set. So you can see the tab safety is disengaged, but there's still that is far beyond what I think a lot of people think of when they go to the wall or take up the slack, right? That I didn't get my calipers out, but millimeter. Yeah, I could say that, internet millimeter. The other thing that's happened here is that I have opened up the back plate, which is consistent with those FBI tests of the Michigan State Police gun, because then they took a tool and stuck it in there to disconnect the trigger mechanism, the back of the trigger bar, in this case with the Glock. With the design in the Sig, it's a little different, but to disconnect the internal parts that are holding back what I call the toe of the striker. The striker is under spring pressure. Moving this trigger has just deactivated the plunger safety, right? It has just pushed up. Here's a Glock. It is just
sure, I got one. Oh, you got it.
On that part of the gun. And by pushing up on that, because the trigger bar has moved backwards, even with that little bit of movement, remember I showed you guys the little flapper on this one that disconnects it, the way it works in the Sig fire control unit. So that's what I think people need to understand, is this is pulling the trigger, right? So now when I jam this in here, if I get the right angle and can disconnect the internals from that toe of the striker, bear with me, doing it a little bit backwards.
Nice.
Gun goes bang. So now it's like, oh my gosh, Rob, the gun's gone bang and it's a Glock. Does that mean Glocks aren't safe? No, it means don't cut a giant ass hole in the back of your backplate, jam a tool in there after you stuck a screw in the trigger. Right?
So I think one of the
now,
things,
this isn't a magic trick. You're like, oh, the trigger's back now. Yeah, the trigger's back now because once I stuck this in there and removed it, that takes all the spring tension off it, and this is where it ends up, right? So now I've got my great, it's jammed in there, but
can you show it? Because the internet is going to say it's a lie. Try and show
it. The internet. Rob Ping has had an ND on. They're reckless bastards. Right,
so in the demonstrations that we've seen online with people pressing the trigger, they're making the point that the trigger has barely moved, right?
Yeah, but this trigger had barely moved too. That's what I'm saying.
But that must mean that must mean that the pulling of the trigger, moving that plunger, is a very efficient lever, right? It barely has to move for that plunger to move.
Yeah. So let me look at a PD10 here. Like, so this we call it the bird's head internally. Get something to point at it. That little guy right there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That thing moves backwards you can see it moves backwards, and it might even kind of come up a little bit. Depending on if I got the angle right, you'll see it come up a little bit as it moves backward. What that's doing is it's pressing upward on. All right, let me take this one. Okay, gun's clear. Show the internet. Show you. Convince myself. Okay, so now what that's doing when that bird's head moves backwards, it is pushing up on that plunger.
Right.
Right. So you
and
can
that
see
plunger's
that's a
blocking
pretty wide. That's a pretty long surface area. There's a lot of engagement there.
Yeah.
Now this is my carry gun. What's that?
What's that plunger doing for those that don't know?
I'm gonna show you here. So
okay,
let me see how I can best demonstrate this. I think right now, if I pull down my little dental pick here, you see how the that's that toe I was talking about of the striker, right?
Mhm.
So it goes backwards
Yeah.
against that spring, and then it gets sent forward. Now, right now, if you can see where it is, it can only go, if I pull down on it, it can only go so far forward. It can't like reach all the way down to the that part of that channel in the slide. It can't get to the bottom of it, right? If I need an extra hand here, if I push in on that plunger, now I'm pushing in on that plunger, and now you see how far down it can go?
Mhm.
So that extra little bit of space, it's not a lot, but that extra little bit of space is the difference between the striker poking through the breech face, right? So that little slot, I think you can see it there.
Yep.
There.
Yeah.
See, yeah, you can see it's sitting pretty darn close to it, right? If you look in there, you can see that striker point in there, right? Well, it can't poke through that wall unless I move this out of the way. Maybe I can do it for the camera. Move this out of the way, push in on the plunger, and then there, you see
Yeah.
it protruding?
Yep.
There we go. Yep.
Yeah, so now I'm pushing in on the plunger and pushing down on that toe against the spring pressure. And that's what's allowing that to come through and pierce or pop, put enough pressure on the back of that primer. So that's an unfired one, and here's the fired one we just used, right? So
But the slide
and
didn't
by
go
I have
back.
this. So I was gonna say, like, so this is my actual carry gun, right? This is the original design on that plunger. Somewhere here it is. I also have we've improved that part just to get a little bit more smoothness. And if you can see, let me get my fingers out of the way. Show you this one. And ooh, if I can do this left-handed. This one. If you look at these side by side, you can see that this one on the right here is much more rounded.
Mhm.
And that just gives us a little bit smoother trigger press, but there's still a huge amount of engagement there on the surface for that bird's head. But the transition from being off the bird's head to being on the bird's head is made a little smoother by that domed nature. So for like 2 years now, we've been shipping the guns with this domed plunger. And one of the things we've done internally as we've improved certain parts and we've smoothed out certain areas of friction, we changed some coatings. We also sent the gun for a whole nother series of drop testing. And of course, we've done all the weird 45-degree angles from the Sig drop test, we call it, because we want to be sure. We don't want to end up in court. Somebody says the gun went off when we dropped it, and we haven't tested the latest version of the part. So even a small change like that. If you look at, I held up that Glock earlier, right? The Glock, this is a 19 plunger, and you can see where it's like fully round. It's got a little bit of a chamfered edge to make that transition smoother. If we look at, let's clear this, right? If we look at the inside of the 48, the way the 48's made, it's got the same kind of a bird's head concept there, pokey part on the trigger bar. But this has a much steeper walled ramp, the way they designed the internals here. So it's a much steeper ramp up to push that plunger down in, right, in this area. So there's less surface area front to back and a much steeper ramp as you come up onto it with that steeper ramped bird's head.
And this is the gun you just did it on.
This is the guy I just did it on, but that's the factory one. Now, the other thing is you think about something like the skimmer triggers or some of the other triggers that are out there. There are ways to manipulate how much movement you need of the trigger to disengage that drop safety. And in fact, I think there are some aftermarket triggers out there that completely take that block safety out of the equation. So it's preloaded. And I think those are obviously, meant only for specific competition type applications, things like that. But if you understand what's going on inside your gun, then you have to understand that you can change these things, you can modify these things, and that hopefully the company that's engineered the gun has put everything in an appropriate balance for the intended purpose. If it's a target shooting gun, it's going to be more sensitive and more prone. It's going to have a smaller window, let's say, for negligence than a duty gun should. And I think this, again, comes back to part of the mistake of what the 320 is. So now let's talk about the height, because obviously I combined two failure demos there. I showed you the FBI sticking the thing in the back and the Wyoming guy barely moving the trigger thing, right? Well, if I stick the 320 fire control unit in here, jam it down into this grip. This is a Wilson grip. I guess I should have put it in a regular one, but and it might matter. Some people have noted that like the X5 Legions have not had any of these type. The X5 carries and the Legion, some of the other guns out there, particularly with the metal frames, or maybe with better polymer, like maybe Wilson's using better polymer than Sig is using. That may be a contributing factor. Is that as people are taking this? I know I have a regular Sig hand. Oh, there it is. As people are taking this little metal tab in and out of their guns for whatever reasons, maybe they have other grip modules they like to use. This is wearing out this back area of the grip module, right? As you stick that in there, and that's affecting the tolerance. So that's going to affect the connection between what's going on with this part of the internals of the gun and what's going on inside of the slide with both the plunger safety, or in this case, they have a different kind of setup. Their striker block safety there, that little lever that's moving, and the toe of their striker. So the interaction between what's going on in the top part of the gun and the bottom part of the gun may very well be affected over time. That relationship can change based on wear and tear in your plastic grip module as you insert and remove and jiggle around your fire control unit. And that's something that is yet to be determined as well. That could be causing a tolerance issue. Ultimately, we have to go back to what this is, right? And from this angle, right, this could be a P250 because the grip module is specifically a P250. You guys might remember when I still had a place in Denver and Denver outlawed private gun making. So I couldn't do any more of my 3D printing projects in my place in Denver. I printed a P250 grip module. And it looks like you're printing the frame. If it were the Glock or something else, it looks like you're printing a non-serialized firearm, right? An illegal firearm in Denver. But I printed out that P250 almost like as a oh, look at this. I could get arrested because people don't understand in Denver, maybe the police officers, the city attorney, whoever, maybe the state attorney general's office, they don't know the difference in the gun laws. And that this grip module is not a firearm with this type of design. Well, the P250 grip modules will accept the 320 FCU. And what Sig did was they just repurposed a hammer-fired gun into a striker-fired gun. In a hammer-fired gun, everything that matters is happening down here in the frame. And with a hammer-fired gun, because of the nature of the pivot of the hammer, in order to generate enough force, you generally need the bore axis to be higher because you need a greater distance between what's happening with the trigger and what's happening with at the primer when that firing pin or striker is hit by the hammer. So that pivot requires a certain amount of height in most guns. And it's something that's, I think, again, if you know how guns work, you understand why you get a lower bore axis potential with a striker fired gun. But in this case, Sig left a very, in my opinion, a ridiculously high bore axis with this gun. Can I get this all to go together? Probably not in this configuration because I don't have this seated completely well. Once again,
more hammer.
Once again, more hammering, right? So, now I think I can do it.
More cowbell.
So this is what I think is a ridiculously high bore axis, right? So over the part of the gun that interacts with the top of my hand and where the bullet comes out, right, I just think is ridiculously high on this gun. But it's necessarily high because we're working from an original hammer-fired design. So in order to keep the same proportions and keep the kind of signature classic Sig look, you end up with that kind of a situation. If I find, let's throw this on there. You know, if you look at the bore axis here with a striker-fired gun that takes full advantage with no substructures, no FCU chassis, no ABS plastic insert for the ejector like the Glocks use. This is using the frame to hold all the parts like a classic metal gun would. It lets us be incredibly thin and incredibly low with the bore axis, as opposed to, you know, incredibly high. If I do it kind of that way.
And I talk about this quite a bit.
It's kind of like laughable.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah, I talk about this a lot. With a lot of people who talk about smooth trigger press, is like you should probably look at the moment of inertia way before you look at a smooth trigger press if you're worried about that type of stuff. And this is what we call bore axis in the gun industry, but in science they call it the moment of inertia, and the energy is higher proportional to the point of pivot. So the higher it
Right.
is, the more angular momentum you're going to have. And this is what people miss when choosing a gun for self-defense, is small shit like this that can make you a better shooter, or more efficient shooter, is what we're looking for self-defense.
Right. Once
Is
again, understanding what's actually happening with the physics and the engineering. And that's why we stress for instructors that they understand what's happening with the guns too, so they can explain to their students, why they're making good or bad choices. Well, in this particular case, we're not even worried about that issue of
yeah.
recoil management or anything else. What we're worried about here is the play and the tolerance issue that a wiggle gives you up here. If we have a tolerance issue between the grip module and, more importantly, the actual chassis and the slide, as that moves any degree, if it moves half a degree, well, think about it. If I'm here and I'm engaged with, I don't know, let's see if I can get a different color. So I need this to engage with that part, right? So let's go it this way now. So if I got that engaged with this part, if I move this half a degree, I'm not off of the surface. I still have some engagement. But if I move it a full degree, well, now I'm off. Now my striker slides off, right?
Yeah.
That's the concern. That's what that wiggling is doing. So that screw in the trigger is deactivating the striker block, and then the wiggling is taking the engagement away. And there's a whole bunch of reasons why this engagement might not be as perfect as SIG wants it. One of them is chipping mimmed parts, right? And we've seen some of those close-up photos in the FBI examination where they've shown where the entire bearing surface area that's intended to be engaged isn't actually engaged. Imagine I'd spin this around. Now I've just got that little tip, because this is not an even flat surface. That rounded tip is all I've got engaging with this. And if this is rounded instead of flat or chipped, now I've got maybe very little bearing surface holding this all together. And then I start wiggling the top of the slide, and maybe if I wiggle from up here, half a degree is enough. If I wiggle from down here, half a degree wouldn't be enough. And that's the bore axis issue. So the longer these levers are, the longer that these parts have to be to get them engaged, because the bore axis is much higher in this gun, because that has to be longer. That means it is going to be less tolerant. All other things being equal, it's going to be less tolerant of any given wiggle. So 1 degree at 3 millimeters only might move to the right or left enough to stay engaged. But if you've got 1 degree at a full centimeter, 10 millimeters, that might be enough to move it off of engagement. And I think that's what you're seeing with that wiggling motion. But again, I think it's really important to keep restating after the primary striker block internal safety has been deactivated.
Well,
by
not only that too,
moving.
but wouldn't pulling the trigger even a little bit reduce that friction in that area, because you're already starting to move?
So if you can see what's going on in this design, right? When I move that trigger just that little bit, I'm deactivating the internal safety, but nothing else is moving.
Nothing else
When
is
I'm
moving.
quote unquote taking up the slack. Then
Right.
you can see from this side, probably you can see it best. What you're looking at is this part right here. You're going to see it move down. See it moving down there?
Yeah.
So there is
the
period
first thing that happens with just the quote unquote taking up the slack is I deactivate the internal safety. Then when I continue to press, I move that down, and by moving that down, that's when I'm moving it. Let's go back to my horrible facsimile here. When I move that down, that lets this go forward. And of course, this is that toe that's attached to the actual striker that moves forward like that.
So how many other major
So I've got this here blocking it. The trigger press moves this down. That lets this whole thing move forward, and that pokes the back of the ammunition.
So on the Glock design, though, part of that trigger press is not only moving that block out of the way, but is also pulling the striker mechanism back.
Yeah. So let's go back into the PD10. I think you can see what's going on here. So the equivalent piece is right here, right? So that little piece right there is holding on to the that toe right there, right? So we're not, quote unquote, fully cocked. Some striker fired guns are fully cocked, some are half cocked, whatever you want to call it. There's a certain amount of energy there in it. So what's happening now when I move the trigger, you can see that is going to go backwards and down. You can see all that movement backwards.
Mm-hmm.
That's the final movement of the striker backwards against spring tension to load it with more power. And then the last piece of the puzzle, which you can't really see very well in here, is right there. Let me get one that's out of the gun. I probably have one over here somewhere.
So the 320
that's the beauty of being at the factory where you make those guns, is you have the parts.
Well, yeah, but I may not. They don't like it when I build the guns on my desk. You know, it turns out like so. Talk amongst yourselves.
So correct me if I'm wrong, Edgar, but the 320 is fully cocked.
That is my understanding.
Yes, my understanding is that it is completely 100%. I mean, it might be 99,
but it has enough energy.
And again, it might be. It's so close that a manufacturing tolerance issue could cause that surface, the bearing surface, to be uneven, and maybe it puts the striker under a little more tension just because of that.
Yeah.
So the argument could be for a safer striker fire design would be that it doesn't make a lot of sense to have a fully cocked striker if what you're trying to accomplish there is a shorter trigger press. Like you're trying to keep, because you would think like the entire action of the trigger going back would be partially to pull the trigger or pull the striker backwards before releasing it. But if we want a shorter trigger press, then that means we need more energy stored ready to go in the spring.
Correct.
So it needs to move not at all or barely at all.
Yeah.
To get
right.
that
Not only shorter,
press,
but also lighter, right?
Lighter.
You're putting that energy in there. So again, if you look in here, we're looking specifically at this post right there.
Yeah.
That piece that sticks up. That is this, right? So you can see that when I have that perfectly vertical, this angle is sloped downward. So the way these parts connect, this is a beat up old trigger bar. This wing from that side of the trigger bar lives just under there, right? You can see that. And when I pull the trigger, remember it moved backwards and went down. So the downward motion is caused by that interaction with that slope. So it's being pushed down as I pull backwards, but it's being pushed down by that slope. That's what pulls this part down off that striker. Is I'm pulling the trigger bar would move straight back, but that slope on this piece is what actually causes that to disconnect from the striker and that let the striker go forward. So it has to move, about that much. It's just at the very front of that, and it moves to the back of that. And that's what you're feeling when you press the trigger.
And it pivots, right? The trigger part pivots so that little tab, or what you call the bird's head, can fully engage on the.
This is pivoting. So as you can see that the bird's head up here is ramped so that it catches. Where did I put those little bits? There we go. So what it's doing is it's catching. And this is, if people are wondering, like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. Well, here's what happens. This is sitting in the gun like this vertically, right? And normally this chunky metal bit up here is what's blocking the striker from moving forward. And as this presses up, that opens up this channel, and that channel lets the striker go forward through that channel. So the striker is blocked by the meaty part up the top. The bottom engages with the bird's head. It gets pushed up, and then the striker can go forward through that channel after it's released from the back of the trigger bar. So the ramp that you see at the back of this bird's head is what's engaging that part, right? So this is sitting here kind of like this. And let me get the right angle. As this moves backwards, it pushes that up. So this moves straight back, and that pushes this up. And when this goes up from here to there, that's enough to get this chunky part out of the way of the striker, which we looked at earlier. And again, I don't think everybody needs to understand how this all works. I would go back to 10 years ago. 12 years ago now, when the guys at the table voted me as the guy that would be most likely to be able to design a gun. We had a guy in the sales, we had a guy that was an importer, we had guys that did a lot of different things at the table, but I was the instructor, I was the shooter guy. I was actually the guy who had the most experience with the actual guns on the ranges with people when we had that discussion. So they all looked at me, but the reality is I could have reverse engineered, right, any kind of gun and just said, well, here's this. I was much more worried about things like the bore axis and things like the grip width and the trigger press, what the trigger press was going to feel like, and how the magazine release worked and how the slide stop worked. I was worried about the user experience stuff, but I really didn't have any vision for what the internals would look like, because I just never had to pay that much attention to the internals. So I wouldn't have been able to tell you nearly as much about how the inside of a Sig versus the inside of a Canik versus the inside of a Glock versus the inside of the PD-10. I wouldn't have been able to tell you a tenth of what I can tell you now 12 years ago. I've had to learn a lot more about what's going on internally in order to bring like my vision of how a gun should feel to market. And that requires the engineers and the tool and die makers and all these experts in the manufacturing world who have educated me about, metals and coatings and angles and thousandths and all this stuff. A lot of people, that's why it's kind of what hurts the most. If the internet can still hurt me, it's the guys in the comment section are like, so basically you just made another Glock. Life would have been so much easier.
I thought hurting you was asking you how long it was going to take for it to get to market.
Have you seen the inside of a Bursa BP9? Have you seen the inside of this gun? Like, you're watching a video showing you the inside of this gun. You could Google what the inside of other guns look like, and you could figure out that there's literally 0 parts that I can take from this and put in any other gun without a bigger hammer than what I've been using here for this video.
Yeah, it's kind of like
and people are, somebody said yesterday I did an RXM. I'm like,
yeah,
really
it's like telling Ford you just made another Chevy.
Yeah. Oh,
it's just like, okay. No, like that's not the way it
Ford,
works.
Right? Have you seen the Nürburgring numbers from last week? Ford wishes they had made another Chevy. They got a $325,000 Mustang that just got beat by 3 seconds by the new vet. Poor Ford.
Well,
poor little guys.
It's not the same. Let's move on. Fuck that conversation.
All right, we're not gonna talk about cars.
Don't you talk shit about my ovals.
I drive a Ford. I right now I have a Toyota, a BMW, a Ford, a Dodge, and
do you really have a BMW?
A Mini Cooper, which is kind of like a BMW. Remember that? I drove that once to a meeting we were at, like little 3-cylinder thing. So, and a Ducati. So I'm pretty well represented across the board. But I do feel bad for the guys who were excited about that $300,000 Mustang. First of all, a $300,000 Mustang
is crazy.
You're silly.
It's crazy. Well, and this is again the market saying they want something without knowing what they really want, and this is how we end up with really shit guns. This is how we end up with the Sig P320 is the market saying on Reddit very loudly, this is what I want, and then it comes out, and then very quickly you're like, oh, that's not what I want. And I did say this in the video that I made about the P320 is I do wish there was more of these conversations with the people who actually make the guns to educate the humans about what they really want. Now, there's always room, and we get it and we understand there's always room for the competition people. There's always room for the silly stuff, the fun stuff, right? You're making a little silly shit that's going to shoot drones out of a fucking 3D printed bullet. Like, that's fucking silly, but so there's always room for weird shit. But when we're talking about self-defense stuff, when we're talking about defending your life, there needs to be more education, I think, from the people who actually build the fucking guns, to tell people you don't need all of the extra shit, instead of just saying, yep, yeah,
like, okay, so this is clear, right? But this, if you take a look at the amount that this trigger needs to move, right? Like this is a Glock. It's a Polymer 80. It's a gun that I built it's a competition Polymer 80 Glock build, using like almost no OEM parts. The magazine release, I think, is OEM. Otherwise, that's a barely moving trigger. I'm pretty sure that the bird's head part on this is already engaging that drop safety, and it takes barely any pressure and barely any weight to make this thing go off. This is a competition style trigger in a Glock, right? As opposed to a normal Glock trigger that requires a lot more pressure and a lot more movement. These things can exist. Like I have this. It's safe enough for the intended purpose. I would never carry it. I wouldn't stage it with a home defense gun. I wouldn't hand it to you when you came to visit and have you go out to the range and go bang and say, "Oh, I wasn't ready for it to go bang," because that would be reckless and negligent of me. I would tell you, like, I would show you exactly everybody that's ever shot this. I show them. I said, "Look, this is going to go off like when you breathe on it. It's like a cocked Colt Python, like it's ready to go." Right. And people are like, "Oh, it's a Glock," and they don't think about it. And then, but at least they're pointing at the berm when it goes, and they say, "Oh, I didn't know, I wasn't ready for it." Right. And what's hilarious is with, my gun, right? People will go out there and they'll start shooting it and they'll go to take up the slack and there's no slack.
There's no slack.
It engages right away. So the first I'll see this weird hesitation on the trigger, then they'll start pressing the trigger and then they'll let go and they'll sometimes, not always, but some people who are really used to there's nothing and then there's everything and then it breaks on a striker fired gun, they'll start pressing the trigger. You can tell who's never shot a double action gun before, right? And they'll start pressing the trigger and then they'll like, "I don't think it's working." Just keep pressing. like it needs to move more than a quarter of an inch, right?
Yeah.
And what's funny is when you measure the total distance of movement here, it's not any different than like an M&P or an XD or a Glock. What's different is you're feeling the weight right away, and the weight stays pretty consistent all the way through. So you're getting 4.5, 5 pounds all the way through the full press, as opposed to getting nothing, hitting a wall, and then getting everything, or having something that ramps up more like the Glock does, goes from a certain amount to more, and then it breaks. So the trigger feels different, but as countless people have demonstrated in their reviews, once you understand what the trigger is doing, that gun's more capable. It's capable of more accuracy than I ever needed it to be for a defensive gun.
So would a useful analogy be for like competition to self-defense be the difference between racing slick tires on a NASCAR track versus tires with tread on them on roads that everybody drives on?
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. I think the slick tires on any kind of racing track where you're going to use slick tires on a controlled surface in a controlled environment versus your all season or your all terrain type tire that you put on your car so that you can just drive and not think about your tires, right? I mean, for people who follow F1, right? Like, half the damn conversation and all the commentary is about the tires. When are they going to change the tires? Which tires are they going to? How long are the tires going to last? Are they degrading? Did they warm them up to the right temperature? Have they broken them in on the first couple laps? Like, half of the conversation with F1 racing is about the tires for a reason, right? It's like the science of the tires, and the tires are incredibly important. But one raindrop falls and they all run and have to get the wet tires, have to get the special tires for the rain weather, right? In NASCAR, one raindrop falls and they all stop racing, and they bring out giant trucks that hair dryer, giant blow dryer trucks to dry the track off. But God forbid they race in the rain.
It's the same principle. It's just traction, but it's not the same application.
Right. So a competition trigger is very much like that. It's just got no room for error. It's only really designed to work inside of this narrow window, and it works really, really, really well in that narrow window. You got to stop.
This is when people show up with like staccatos and all the douchery with the smooth trigger press. This is what I think if we're going to use cars as an analogy.
You're right. Yeah. Okay. That's a 320 trigger. That's probably treaded. You're actually moving most of the tread away from where it could ever possibly touch the road.
When I hear people say I did this because I want smooth trigger press, that's exactly what I think about it, is this douchery that just like, you don't understand how it all works.
Yeah, well, my thing's always why? Like, why?
Yeah.
Well, I want it to be easier to hit the target. Well, how easy does it need to be? And once people realize they can hit the targets, that they're overwhelmingly 99% of the stuff they're going to need to do, that they can do it with a stock Glock 19 or PD10 or XDS or whatever. Once they realize they can, I think they get past it. Now, plenty of graduates of our training, and I think, I say our because you guys teach the same philosophies and run the same classes a lot of times. Plenty of people who get it and who carry a gun like we would say, yeah, good job. They also have the range toys, right? They have the competition type stuff, and there's nothing wrong with that. Like both things can coexist, but you have to be willing to accept the reality of the range is a racetrack for guns. So just like you can perform really well if you set your car up exactly the same way on the range, for that racetrack, like the same way for the same weather, for the same temperature, for the same series of corners and all that, 100%, absolutely no problem, then you're good. But if you start thinking because you can drive so well with that car set up that way with those tires at the track, you need to have your daily driver commuter car with those tires. That's when you would learn that lesson in 12 minutes in the real world, right? But you'd never, thankfully, I would say is thankfully we live in a world where most people never actually have to use their guns anywhere but the racetrack. Correct. So we don't have to learn that hard lesson that people are making really bad choices. The 320 is just such a bad choice and such a bad design that people are learning the lesson that you don't want these guns with really narrow windows for failure. You don't want narrow windows for failure out in the real practical duty carry home defense world. And that's what we've got, I think, with the 320. It's not that those tires don't make sense in context. It's not that this trigger wouldn't make sense in context. I think one of the contributing factors to why we don't see the X carries and those fancier, more expensive versions of the gun with exactly the same trigger, why don't we see them implicated? They're being used by a more discerning owner. They're being, in most cases, they're being owned by someone who's treating it like the range toy that it is, or like the competition gun that it is. Yeah. They're not throwing it around like it's a Glock 19. And that's the problem is now you sell this like it's a Glock 19, but it actually has the window, the margin for error, that window for negligence tolerance. Then you throw in the MIM parts, then you throw in the mass production, then you throw in the quality control, then you throw in the obstinance of we're not going to put a tab on it because we don't think we need one, regardless of the fact that this keeps happening. And we're going to say, there's no problem, even though there's clearly something going on. It just keeps building and building and building and building and building to the point where I think they've killed the design, whereas they might have been able to save it, 2 or 3 times in the last decade. I can't take anybody seriously right now who's carrying the gun. Like Zeke Stout was on a video we did talking about this a couple weeks ago with Tony Simon and those guys. And he was saying he still trusts his gun. Like he's wiggled it, he's messed with it, he's done this. And I'm like, yeah, but you can have a problem with any gun. There could be a mechanical failure with any gun. There could be there could be a mistake you could make with any gun. Why? Like what's going to happen the day you make that mistake or that mechanical failure happens with the 320? Literally everyone is going to say, I can't believe you were still carrying a 320, dude, with all this going on. And he right there on air, he's like, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. So he's like, I'm less confident now just simply because of that social factor, that sociological factor of, judgment, right? People said, if I banned the gun, I haven't banned the gun for my classes, but I want to see who shows up with one. I want to see what kind of holster they're using. I want to see what their attitude is. I want to see if they've checked the tolerances between the top and the bottom parts, right? I want to see that before I tell them whether or not they're allowed to use it in the class. But I'm not going to blanket ban it because, again, first of all, I don't want to jump on the bandwagon. And second of all, I don't think this is any different than it was 5 years ago, right? The airmen dying, we don't know much about that. Right. We could still, this is like one of those active shooter situations, right? Where it's like, there were 5 people, there were 5 shooters. Now there was 1 shooter reported by 5 people from 5 different angles. There was 1 shooter. This could very well be, there was nothing on the trigger. And then we find out the guy left a note and killed himself. Like we don't know. And until that investigation plays out and we actually find out what happened, which we may never know, for me, that airman, as tragic as it is, and feel bad for the family, feel bad for his friends, feel bad for him, obviously, that doesn't change this for me.
Well, we have incidents that are on
the
video.
Same problems it's always had.
Yeah, we have incidents that we have on video, and we still don't know exactly what happened.
Right. I find some of those video incidents much more compelling to me than what we know so far about the airmen. Right. I don't think the fact that someone did die for me, doesn't change
Correct.
the curiosity and the question about what is actually happening, what actually happened. So the ones that I've seen on video where the gun being jostled or just holstering it causes it to go off, most of those videos aren't detailed enough for me to know whether or not something was manipulating the trigger, or if the trigger was dirty or belly button lint or whatever, like it was already gummed up and it was pushed back, or if they had modified the internals. I don't know anything about most of those videos, but they are more compelling to me than the anecdotal information we have so
Correct.
far about what happened at the air base in Wyoming.
Yeah.
Or Montana, was it Montana or Wyoming?
I don't know.
I think it was Wyoming. I don't know.
I think it was
could be
too.
wrong.
Yeah, the Wyoming gun guy and them. Lots of Wyoming with the 320.
Yeah. I want to go back to something you said about how thank God we haven't found out, because, you know, in the real world we don't have to use our guns as much as maybe in the past, or, you know, it's a relatively low number of incidents where we actually have to use the gun. And this is a good thing from a safety point of view, and this is a good thing from a civil society point of view. But from a refinement of the tool and the weapon, it's an unfortunate situation, because I think that's where you find out what is truly efficient, is when you have lots of experience with that tool in context. And beyond that, a lot of this is theoretical, and it's hard to have those theoretical arguments when you don't have the concrete experience that teaches us, you know, like you look at war and how war develops weapon systems. You know, effective weapon systems get developed during conflict. When we develop weapon systems outside of conflict, we apply them and we're like, oh, well, it doesn't work, or it doesn't work like we thought it would, or it would only work with this modification. That's why you see tanks driving around with you know, aftermarket cages built around them, because nobody even thought about a drone falling in from above. So it's a limitation of the market. You know, when Edgar says that people don't really know what they want, is because we really don't know. Like, we have theory, we have principles and concepts.
We don't know what we need. I think your point about the military evolving weapon systems and strategies and tactics, right? A lot of times we say we're fighting the last war, right? Because our tactics and weapons and equipment and doctrine, strategy, everything's developed to a razor's edge in a 20-year global war on terror in the Middle East. But if we deploy to the Pacific Rim, we deploy to Taiwan, it may be completely different, right? In that environment, and the warfare may be completely different. If we were to send troops to the Ukraine right now, it'd be radically different, right, than what we experienced in the Middle East. So we would see evolution, and we're starting to see that evolution because of just observing what's been going on in the war, right? So in Ukraine. But I think that the best analogy we can go back to is that driving, right? People just drive. And they drive in the background while they're listening to the radio, while they're talking to their friends, are looking for the street sign, they're following the navigator. The driving is just happening in the background because we have to apply our driving skills. And the car choices and the truck choices that most people make for their primary vehicles are relatively very practical. Now, you could spend $90,000 on a pickup truck or $19,000 on a pickup truck, but if you're buying a pickup truck, there's probably a reason, right? You're probably not buying a pickup truck if you want to drive really fast around the curves. Like, that's not why you bought the pickup truck. If you're buying it, you might buy a Miata, you might buy a GR86, but you're buying one of those because you want to be able to drive really fast around the curves without any horsepower whatsoever, right? Like, you're making that decision.
But if you buy a GR86, you probably just don't want to drive because it's going to be at the mechanic all the time.
Those are stop. Don't hate on the FRS 86 GR, all Scion, whatever all those things are. They're like, you know, contemporary Miatas.
Contemporary.
Which is a compliment.
It is a compliment.
In a compliment way. Don't give me any Miata hate.
I would drive a Miata. I would take a Miata before the 86.
Well, now you would. Thin Edgar would. Big Edgar.
Thin Edgar. Fat Edgar.
Yeah, Big Edgar would not have been able to do that.
Yeah, couldn't get in. That's fucked up.
But earlier, I think kind of to that point, just to add on to that, the one context where a lot of people do put their guns through the paces is competition.
Yeah.
Where they think like, well, I'm going to use my gun, I'm going to shoot targets that are supposed to mimic people, I'm going to shoot a lot of targets, I'm going to shoot them as fast as I can. That sounds like what I would do in a self-defense situation. So then the context shifts to, well, this is where I need to be the most efficient. And of course, again, it goes back to traction is traction, but it's not traction. And so that becomes like the crucible. The competition becomes the crucible to prove the defensive firearm when it's not really the crucible.
Correct.
It just looks kind of like the crucible.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not understanding that you're using the wrong metrics, right? And that's really all. Unfortunately, people say, "Well, that's all we have." Well, in an unguided, unsupervised situation, it is much harder. You don't have the scenario training. The information processing, to me, is infinitely more important than the difference between 5 shots per second and 6 shots per second.
Mhm.
But it's hard and cumbersome, and it's not as much fun, and it's very much more subjective to try to mimic the necessity for information processing while you're doing all this stuff with the gun out on the range, or to go to a simulator or get involved in really well-run force on force training, and get into scenarios. That's all infinitely more cumbersome than just pulling out a timer and shooting a quote unquote standards drill or a qualification drill, or going to a competition. So that's how most people test their skills, but they're testing objective performance in a controlled environment.
Uh-oh.
In the fight where they need subjectively to just win,
Mhm.
to deter the bad guy or stop the bad guy from being able to hurt them. So a psychological or physical stop is equal in the real world, right? And I'm not saying it's okay to miss. I'm not saying fire warning shots, right? I'm not saying go with the Biden tactics. What I'm saying is that's the reality of the situation. Is that 2, 3, or 4 shots into the chest? If the bad guy drops the knife and runs away, I guess it really didn't matter if I hit him twice, 3 times, or 4 times. And if the first shot at him is what made him drop the knife and turn and run away, then it didn't matter if I was carrying 18 rounds or 3, right? And that's the harsh reality of it. And people don't want to hear that, especially when you start twisting your tactics based on your politics, at least your claimed tactics, your claimed strategy. When people are saying, well, if you're going to say that, then I guess you're in favor of magazine restrictions bans, or people are going to quote Rob Pincus, the Personal Defense Network guy, as saying you don't really need more than 10 rounds anyway, and I'm not saying you shouldn't be allowed to carry. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a spare magazine. I'm just saying you're not undergunned if you're only carrying 8+1, if you're only carrying a revolver, if you're only carrying 10+1, if you're only carrying 15+1. Should you have a spare mag? Sure. There's a whole bunch of reasons you'd have a spare mag, but you're probably going to need to shoot 30 rounds is not the reason.
Yeah. I do want to kind of go back a little bit, because you were pretty passionate before we jumped on about and I want to make sure we have a good conversation about it, unless you feel like we've had a good enough conversation about this idea of designs not being made in the US anymore. This idea of most of everything we get is either old here in the US or it's European based.
I don't, it's become, I think I'm a little more sensitive to it just because there's so many people, flag waving and let's support American companies and America first and all that in our community, right? People are living that lifestyle on their Instagram. And yet, there really isn't a lot of innovation. And I can tell you firsthand, there isn't a lot of, like, I've had exactly 0 people, as far as I know, buy a PD-10 because it's an American-made gun designed by Americans with an American-owned company, right? And you would think in today's market, in the politics of today, everybody's Instagram presence, you would think there would be at least some level of pushback to why support a European company that has a office in the US, that is incorporated in the US because of import laws and a whole bunch of other things. I don't think the import laws are a good idea. Like, I would just as soon buy a Glock from Austria. I would just as soon buy a Sig from Germany. I would just as soon, buy an FN from Belgium. I don't need for those guns to be made in America if I'm buying those guns. And the fact that the bureaucracy has required those companies to set up offices and shops here, I'm glad Americans are being employed. But again, at the end of the day, if the gun could be made at the same price somewhere else and it was the same gun, I'm not the guy who won't buy the foreign thing, right? I'm talking to you on a computer that's got some Asian parts in it. I drive, the BMW or the Toyota. We talked about that, the Ducati, right? So I'm not that guy. but there's so many people claiming to be that guy who I know full well have plenty of stuff they're buying off Amazon from China and everything else,
Correct.
but they're also carrying the Glock. They're also carrying the Sig. They're also, celebrating the Bagheera or the Beretta, whatever it is they have and some of them are the Walther. And they say, well, Walthers are made. You used to live in Gallatin, Tennessee. You probably know people, or the kids of people anyway, that you knew are working in that factory and they're employing Americans. And that's great. But if the only reason they're employing Americans is because of, what is it, 922R, the import laws, if that's the only reason they're doing it, if they're doing it because labor's cheaper, believe it or not, in the US than it might be in Europe, right? If that's the reason they're doing it, well, then I don't know that I'm all excited about that. And it is still, at the end of the day, a company that is filtering money tourists, right? They're made in Georgia, but they're filtering money back to Brazil. It's not like Daniel Defense, made in Georgia, where the money stays in America and it's owned by Americans. So I don't, I'm not waving the flag and saying I don't own all these guns, right? Obviously I do. I'm sort of pointing a finger at the people who are pretending this is really important to them, who are gun owners who aren't going out of their way to support American gun design and manufacturing, because what it leads to is the fact that the vast majority of American handguns that are out there are 1911s or updated 1911s, ARs, or revolvers, right? You don't see very many actual new, and I'm not even going to say like the PD10 is a new design. I don't think it's very innovative in this. It's not like got some different mechanics going on the inside that aren't very common mechanics. It's the slimness is very unique, combined with the profile and the bore axis and the trigger and all that. It's a unique conglomeration of established engineering and design principles into a handgun. But what's important to me is that people do realize there's no MIM parts. It's almost all made here in this building. We get some springs brought in, things like that. We don't do the injection molding on the polymer, but it is American made. It is American designed. It is American owned. And I think that should mean more to a lot of the people that are using the flag for politics nowadays.
Your mag release is pretty innovative, and now it doesn't come standard on the gun, but you do have a mag release that I like, and I haven't bought it because I'm poor.
You know a guy, you get a discount.
Well,
I mean, it's got the claw sights. It's got the forward pressure mag release for people with shorter digits. Like, there's some things on there that are different, that are designs I brought to the market. With the claw sights from Ameriglow, I mean, that's 15 years ago we did those. The modification to be able to make certain mag releases forward press instead of having to turn the gun and press in for shorter digited people. That's a modification I've been doing, like the Glock extended mags, for at least 15 years as well. So the internal funneling on the magwell of the ASAR, right? That's something that somewhere around here I've got some of the old guns that I just dremeled that channel to open that channel up. I can't believe no other manufacturer's ever done internal funneling to make it that a little bit more forgiving for the rib on the back of the magazine as you're going into the magwell. Nobody's ever done that before. So there are some things that I brought to the market, or at least I'm hoping to bring to more of the market through Avidity Arms, that are interesting and unique. But I hate to use the word innovative in the sense of, like the Alien gun I mentioned earlier from the Czech Republic, like the way it takes the gas system, which some people would say, well, it's just the gas system from the HK-P7, kind of, but the way they've lopped it on its side and got a really low bore axis, like that is, to me, an innovative gun. The recoil system in the PSD, right up here, the way that system works inside the PSD, which is patented by them, that reciprocating mass that moves with the slide, that is equal to weight with the slide, that gets the mass coming, that you were talking about the scientific issue of angles and momentum. That incident is coming straight back because the weight here is equal to the weight there, and it's balancing out, so there isn't an upward twist, despite the fact that this is a very powerful round coming out of this gun. And that's the reason that the H9 from Daniel Defense doesn't use the system that the Hudson originally used, because Hudson was in violation of this patent. So this is innovative, right? The PD10, I just think, is a really well put together version of some pretty standard engineering and design practices for striker fired firearms.
Yeah. Whoo, that's a lot of information. that was for me.
Play that back at half speed. I'm drinking Monsters. It's 9 o'clock. What do you want me to do?
No, this is for me. This is incredible. And I think this is a conversations that I wish we would have more. But they're nerdy, right? They're to your
They're nerdy,
point.
right? Like, I mean, I could keep going, right? Like the Desert Eagle has some innovation in
Correct.
it for gas. The way that inertia, the way the buffer works in that 300 Win Mag AR design from Nemo, the Omen, right? I could pull that bolt carrier out and people could see the plunger at the back of the bolt carrier group. So you've got the normal spring, you've got another piece in there that's absorbing some recoil, and then you got a plunger in the back of that bolt carrier group. That's innovative.
Yeah.
There's again, the more people understand what's actually happening inside the guns, and you've said this, and I think you've almost convinced me it's more important than I would have thought. The more people understand what's going on inside the guns, the more they can make the right decision. I think it's obvious they can make a more educated decision, but understanding the physics and the engineering might actually help people make the right decision for their application, not just pick the thing that's trending with the influencers on YouTube.
Yeah, and that's the biggest problem is they just hear the influencers and they're like, well, that dude's got 2 million followers, so it must be true. They have 2 million followers somehow, and then they don't understand, and then they end up with shitty guns because we see them in classes with the shitty guns. We see them in classes struggling with really subcompact firearms for a while there, right? Because they didn't understand the kinesthetic alignment and full extension on the arms and how the recoil springs work and all that stuff because they get taught incorrectly. Go.
Weight over the front of the hand. I mean, Springfield discontinued the 4-inch XDS, right, which is a really top-heavy gun with a high bore axis. But for a compact gun with a 4-inch heavy slide, you could shoot that tiny gun really fast because that had so much weight out in front of the hand. So like the 365, like the little broomsticky grip, right, with a very short barrel, that was a very snappy gun. And then they started doing the XLs and the macro, and now the fuse, right? So they started extending it. The Glock, again, the Glock 48 is a very well proportioned gun, right? Like I said, this was my carry gun before the PD10 was ready with the shield mag. So I was at 15+1. This is a great proportioned gun. It's just thicker than it needs to be. Why is it thicker than it needs to be? Well, Glock, might not say it, but I have to think this gun was brought to market ostensibly to be used with the 40 Smith & Wesson as well. So when you build a gun potentially for 40 Smith & Wesson, it's got to be wider than when you build a gun just for 9mm, and that's how we get to be about 11% thinner because we're only for 9mm. We weren't worried about 40 Smith & Wesson. There's really no other justification for why this gun would be as thick as it is. And then obviously you've got the polymer magazines that are what end up necessitating the 10 round capacity versus the steel magazines, the metal magazines that Shield uses for the same gun. You've got some structures in here that also raise the bore axis just because of the way they do their triggers. I don't think our trigger is less safe. Our trigger is just buried down in the gun more because we don't have the substructure inserts that are like holding the different parts.
Yeah, PD10 doesn't have the housing, right? In the back.
Doesn't have the housing, right? Yeah. So there's explanations for all this stuff. And I think a lot of people don't understand, and maybe they don't care to understand, and that's okay. But when you don't care to understand and you're kind of just okay with what feels good on the range when you're shooting against a timer, when you're trying to shoot tight groups, don't be surprised when you end up in the wrong place, according to somebody who is studying what's going on inside, is studying the application of the skills and what's going to be needed and trying to guide you to the right conclusion. If your conclusion is based on ignorance about what's going on inside the guns or how the design affects your ability to shoot, and your metrics, your measurements are what's happening only on the range, not what you might need to do in the real world, well, yeah, we're going to come to different conclusions. And that's okay, except I'm pretty passionate about the idea that people need to be really prepared, not just believe they're prepared. And that's where the controversy comes in. That's where the Rob always thinks he's right. Rob always wants to challenge everybody. Rob wants to he's an evangelist in the words of Ken Hackathorn. Yeah, I guess I am, right? Like,
well, it's because we're doing the Lord's work, so there's that, obviously. And then the other thing is various lords, whatever the Lord is. And then the other thing is humans might need to use what we're teaching them. And we cannot just go off on a whim and just say, well, I feel like it's the best thing because it's trending. and then teach what's trending. And that's hot garbage. Is if you're passionate about what you believe in, you will study it and you will understand it. And again, not everybody needs to be at that level where they need to understand every single aspect of the gun. And like, I'm still one of those when people call it a clip. I'm like, yeah, I know what the fuck you're talking about. Let's move on.
Move on. Yeah, we know what you mean. Right.
We know what you mean.
But
So
in the context of the goal of self-defense or of training and preparation for self-defense to be better, if there is a better way, why are you not doing that better thing? If it fits within your budgets and your constraints, why are you not doing that better thing? So if we're talking about a half a centimeter of bore axis, we say, well, this is better. It's like, yes, objectively it is better. If you bought the wrong gun with all the pennies that you have and you can't afford to sell your gun and buy another one, then you're just going to have to work with what you got.
yeah.
But this one's better. Like,
Right. Or if you're issued the gun, I think I
Mhm.
I do want to just I want to throw out this caveat. I try to throw it out whenever we get down this, our way is better for reasons thing. And we kind of you mentioned like the trendiness and the following this or giving the students what they want. Like that's a big part of it. I think there's obviously a lot of instructors who don't teach what Rob teaches or what we teach in our programs, don't subscribe to it, don't believe in it, whatever. I think there's a lot of different reasons why, right? And I don't want to suggest that everybody who's teaching something different or has different opinions is just doing it for the money or doing it to entertain people. Some of them are, right? Some of them are just regurgitating what they learned in the military or law enforcement or what they've now learned in 20 plus years of a very active private sector training environment with guys who were passing down stuff they knew from the olden days. And some guys have come up with some great drills and great classes and great experiences to make people incredibly better on the range. They're doing their job as far as they're concerned. And it's not fair to suggest that they're not really awesome at what they do. It's just that some people just simply do not understand what potentially is a really important difference between what you do on the range and what you might need to do to defend yourself or your family in the real world. And that is studyable, that's learnable, that's observable. You can go out there, you can do the work to find out what people have actually had to do with their guns, not the anomalies, but that bell curve. What is almost always what people end up needing to do. And if you focus on that, you're going to find out the shooting's the easy part. Like as long as your gun's going to run, and you want it to be reliable and you want a wide window for negligence, mistakes, like that safety margin in the designs and in the reliability, if you have those things, the shooting's going to be the easy part in 99.9% of the defensive shooting situations someone could find themselves in. And once you accept that, you stop worrying about split times, you stop worrying about one hole groups, you stop worrying about sub-second draws or whatever the trendy thing on Instagram is.
Correct. Yeah. Whoo, decompress time.
That's pretty good. I mean, 90 minutes.
Yeah. Well, an hour 46 because we're not going to cut anything.
You already cut it.
Well, I appreciate you dropping in and giving us your time. I know you're a workaholic, and we appreciate that. So
yeah, always good. Always good to have these conversations with you. It's always appreciated, and for me, I like the nerdy stuff. I like let's dive deep into the understanding of why things work the way that they work. And this isn't everything that I do, but this is why I do appreciate always being around people who are willing to push back. Even if it's against stuff that I believe in, it's because that's the only way we could ever become better human beings. And so I always appreciate that. Now, we were talking about how guns work. It was fun to see that if you fuck with a gun, it's going to fucking go off.
Shocking. Yeah.
Shocking.
Yeah.
So,
but it was just a screw. That's the whole. I wasn't manipulating the trigger, and it only moved about a millimeter. I think it's important. This video is really important to me right now. I think in this conversation, everything we've covered and talked about, because when I talked about the 320 with Tony and Zeke and those guys, I didn't have any. It was a regular live, right? And I know you guys wanted to do a live. I appreciate you doing this in a way that we could actually manipulate guns, because I was in a hotel room like after teaching all day in New Mexico, and all of this stuff was probably said one way or another, the stuff when we were specifically talking about the problems with 320, but I think this video has presented that information in a much more absorbable and educational way, because I was able to use the props. And that was the day that I just stuck a screw in the trigger guy put that video out. So it was going viral, and we were all just kind of reacting to it without really understanding what he was trying to show. So I was very I was completely dismissive of it in that video, because it was silly, because he stuck a screw in the gun and then said we didn't move the trigger. Now I understand what he was doing. Still silly. And I just think, again, he probably didn't understand that he was deactivating that safety with just that little bit of, less than a millimeter of movement. And that's because he didn't understand what was going on inside the gun, and didn't have a rationale for why sliding back and forth with such a tall gun matters. I think that's how you end up with that video going viral, right? And I've been joking, like, he's now going to be the internet's like go-to guru for firearms engineering and safety, right? Because he stuck a screw in there. And meanwhile, what we need to do is keep people out of Home Depot. Forget about 320. Just don't go down the fastener aisle at Home Depot, and you'll be fine.
Because you might fall. Now, yeah, and then that fucking screw might accidentally go in, and it goes off fucking at Home Depot.
So, yeah.
Anyway, I honestly didn't even know that's how
giving me the time and the interest.
The Michigan one, I didn't know that's how it was done.
So if you look at the pictures, you'll see it's kind of like the gun's in a vise, and you can kind of see a punch. And they say something like manipulating or using, but you can just kind of make out the gun. The gun's in a vise, and they've got, like, I think one point the guy has like two hands jamming a punch or something into the back of the gun. And they talk about relieving the back plate so they could observe what was going on. Like I said, there's a lot going on with these issues. We had to see if I didn't, because I didn't know, right? You can only go so far with the math. Our striker is tensioned, right? It's, as we described, like, and we demonstrated, it does move back under when you're pressing the trigger. But now, again, let me be really super clear here about what we did for the test. We took the drop safety plunger out entirely. We removed that safety from the gun. We used a trigger that did not have a tab. We removed the tab safety from the trigger. We opened up the back of the gun. We had primed cases that were unloaded but primed cases, and we stuck a tool in the back and maneuvered it so that we were able to push. So we were able to get in there and just hook on that and push that down so that the striker would go forward. And we did 10 times with two different guns, and one gun fired 3 times and one gun fired twice. And we used, very importantly, a bunch of different brass, right? So what does that tell you? Well, primer sensitivity and primer height probably play a role. And to some extent, even how the round chambers, right? And how much tolerance there is on the lockup in any given gun, barrel, extractor, breech face combination, and the striker itself, right? The tolerances on the actual extension of the striker. So there's a whole bunch of things at play, so that what we found out was, like, less than half the time, there is enough pre-cocked force inside the striker when it's at rest that if you teleported or by some other magic made the drop safety plunger come out of the gun, and you had a very small person go in through this hole and jump really hard and push up on the slide and push down on the trigger bar to push it off, or you had a lightsaber kind of thing happen where the back of the gun got cut open, and then a ninja threw a really small dart into the, like, you could maybe.
I see the next Rick Moranis.
Are we under tension enough to make the gun go bang? And then the question is, well, how do we get it so that we have zero chance of the gun ever going bang if the teleporting and the lightsabering and the gremlin all come together? And there's like, now you don't want that 12-pound trigger pull, so that's not going to happen. Okay, so forget about that. And so all of these guns, if you start pulling parts out and you start jamming things in there, eventually you're going to make them go off, right? And like what I don't want is for, you can do it as the teaser if you want, but I don't want like the viral Rob says Glocks are dangerous. Look at this, because I made like I do that just to say this is one of the safest, most proven designs out there in more hands than a 320 probably. Well, if you look at all the Glock family for sure, probably even Glock 48s, there's more of them out there I think than 320s. In public hands, not in the law enforcement military side, but if you just look at the public. And yet, if you stick a screw in the trigger, move it a little bit, defeat the tab safety, cut a hole in the back, stick a tool in there and wrench it around a little bit, you can make it fire without touching the trigger.
That's like the classic
the lesson learned.
Yeah, that's the classic, hey doc, it hurts when I do this.
Yeah.
Well, don't do that.
Don't do that.
Stop doing it. Stop slamming the lid.
Well, for those of you that are still here after we said we were going to log off, I appreciate it because you just got some extra information. And now I have a new script to write for a new Rick Moranis movie. Fucking shrinking people to go into guns and dancing on them. It's gonna be awesome.
That might be what that might be something Sig said in a deposition. Just for a second, it's possible.
It's possible.
Think about it.
Oh shit, that's funny. All right, well, we're gonna end this. I appreciate you, Rob, for hanging out with us. If you guys want to know more about the Avidity Arms, go to avidityarms.com. If you want to learn more about Rob, just ask ChatGPT who Rob Pincus is, and it'll tell you.
Or Grok. Grok does a good job too.
Yeah, but he's gonna say some weird shit. Grok, I hear Grok is doing weird shit. So Grok too, ask Grok, and then Avidity Arms PDN, personaldefensenetwork.com. I'm always proud to be a part of the PDN training tour. So that's always fun. Go check that shit out and everything else that Rob's involved with. So anyways, I appreciate your time, Rob.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Keep up the good work out there in Colorado and wherever your travels take you.
Nice. We'll see you guys.
Peace.